The Healing Spring Show, healing families and communities by breaking the stigma of addiction and expanding the scope of recovery. Now here's your host, John Edmondson.
Welcome back to the Healing Spring Show. Your host here, John Edmondson, and today we have, again, another wonderful guest for you. It's going to be Bobby Temps, and he is a model in the UK, and he's also someone who's gone through some struggles and challenges in his life, and he was able to take those challenges and turn it into an opportunity to help thousands of people now all over the world. And so I hope you enjoy this interview. We took some time, and again, it was kind of via a little bit of a creative way of doing it because he's in the UK and we're here. But I think you'll enjoy the message. He's got a lot to offer us and some deep understanding from personal point of view of how to cope through what depression looks like, body dysmorphia, some eating challenges as well, how to manage that, and how to turn that experience into something that can help others and maybe even enrich your own life. So I hope you enjoy. So Bobby, thank you so much for being on the show with us today, and we're really looking forward to getting to know you. So we have Bobby Temps, and as I understand it, you're a model in the UK and have done some professional work, and also have had some struggles and challenges that we want to talk about today on our show. So,
indeed, yeah. So I'm mainly known, I do indeed do modelling, I'm mainly known for fighting mental health stigma and discrimination. And also working to get education into more schools around basic understanding of mental health that I think every young person should be equipped for. And certainly the kind of lessons I think I'd learnt younger about how mental illness isn't in itself a fault with us, but is something that's a response to trauma that can be worked on and that we deserve support with.
Wow, right out of the gate, you're saying some real powerful statements. I love it. This is I'm so glad we're talking because this is our mission too, is to talk about trauma and destigmatizing this. Bobby, how did you get started on this mission?
It's a difficult one to answer in a way because you could argue my journey kind of really began with dealing with mental illness myself from a young age. So for as long as I can remember, I had symptoms of depression, and I also had body dysmorphia that later developed into an eating disorder, anorexia. And you know, growing up, I didn't know what was going on really. So to me, the depression felt like loneliness because I didn't have the understanding or the emotional awareness to know that it was something more, it was something different. And the eating disorder was part of trying to cope with those feelings of isolation that can be a huge part of stigma, really. And so in many ways, my coping very much shaped the things that I had to overcome in later life. So, you know, moving on from that, I've realised how much I had to learn, and in doing so, and in better understanding my own mental health, I learned how much knowledge I'd amassed to pass on. And so that's how I got into mental health podcasting, as a way to take the skills and the understanding I've built up and, you know, pass it on so that hopefully future generations don't have to struggle for as long as I did.
And how long was that journey for you, Bobby? You said it started when you were younger, and then until how old?
Yeah, so probably it's difficult to trace back, and I have issues with my memory, which is one of the lesser known symptoms of depression for a lot of people. But I would imagine the depression started maybe around 4 or 5, very young. And through that, you know, there was a mixture of not understanding, but then there was also a mixture of like coping and hiding techniques that I think even as a young person, if you don't understand what's going on for you, you still pick up on how people respond to it. And so I was learning to mask the depression and mask how I was truly feeling because I realized it made the adults around me uncomfortable. But in doing things like that, you can easily then start to even hide it from yourself. And that was a similar journey with the eating disorder as well. So it wasn't until then in my teen years, late teens, I guess, like 19, when I got diagnosed with depression initially. And for me, that was a real breakthrough moment because that was my worst period. I'd got really bad with it, and I was struggling to see a way out of that. And, here we have the NHS, the National Health System, which is really brilliant. I had got somewhat obsessive over going to the website and looking at all the symptoms of depression. There's even a kind of quiz thing they do, which doesn't diagnose you, but it gives you an idea whether or not to go to the GP. And even, when I kept doing it, and even when I was playing down my symptoms, it was still telling me to go to the GP. So in a way, when I went and I got the diagnosis, it was actually a sense of relief that, oh no, that actually is something. And if there's something here and there's a name for it, then there's something I can do. And that was a real turning point for me.
Wow. So it was almost like one of the darkest days, but one of the best days in a way, because now you knew at least you're not the only one, because if there's a test for it, obviously there's more than one person out there. But also there might be some hope too, that maybe you could get some help.
Absolutely. And, I think that hope comes in waves. And I'm sure that's something you see in your own practice, that there's not ever really one breakthrough. There's maybe one that we remember or one that was the start of the journey, but it's actually constant growth. And that in recovery can also mean a lot of ups and downs, which is still part of the growth and something I try and educate people on. And so for me, then going into podcasting was a sign of how far I'd come and how much of the internal I managed to shed, that I even felt comfortable talking about my mental health in such a public way. But then at the same time, it was also a reminder of, there's still so much more to understand. And, in doing so, I found a whole community of supportive people that understand mental health. And that's been the most incredible thing, I'd say.
Wow. So at some point, it was like you said, it's ups and downs. I'm really glad you said that, because a lot of people, worked in individual counseling and group therapy. A lot of people think they graduate from therapy or they do a couple months and ta-da, it's all over. But what you're saying is actually this is an ongoing journey. It doesn't stop at any point. It has its ups and downs.
Yes, absolutely. And I would say even beyond that, I've learned so much from other people's experiences. So now on my podcast, I interview people about their experience of mental health and mental health professionals on their perspective. And I've gained so much from learning about conditions that I've never had as well. And so that's why one of the reasons I'm so glad to connect with you and get to talk about addiction, because it's something that I've learned so much about and I feel so connected to, because I see how when it comes to mental health, there's so much crossover. There's so many symptoms that span many mental illnesses. And that's why experiences like having a dual diagnosis, two conditions like I do, is actually incredibly common, and yet is so often misunderstood and rarely represented. Even when we look at the media and see positive representations of mental health, you very rarely see common situations like dual diagnosis or re-diagnosis. And with conditions like addiction, where I feel there is still very specific stigma for that condition that needs to be tackled in a way differing to other mental illnesses, so often the portrayal can fall trap to a winning or failing mentality, that when people have relapse, it's their fault, as opposed to, like we mentioned, actually that being kind of power for the cause. It is something that happens, and if people that are struggling with that are encouraged to blame themselves, then that's incredibly counterproductive, and that can encourage them to go deeper down that spiral.
Yeah, it'll lead them down because they feel like they failed and now they can't make it. And you said a term earlier which I want to come back to. Before we started the show a little bit, I saw you on the camera go, wow, this guy really does look like a model. He looks the part completely. But then you mentioned something called body dysmorphia. What does that mean? How can you help define that for us for the show?
Sure. So body dysmorphia is when you have a distorted view of your own body. And so that can be in a very generalized way. It's very common, for example, with people's weight and their kind of general perception of their appearance. It also can be very specific. So some people will have specific areas of their body that they really loathe, and measures to try and change that in unhealthy ways. Or, that can be a contributing factor with mental illness. So for me, when I was younger, I really struggled with my body image. And the best way I can describe it is I would look in the mirror and it would be like looking at a Picasso painting. That all my features seemed wrong and kind of out of place and misformed. And that was the body dysmorphia. And I'd look at my parents and think, oh, they look like kind of normal looking people. What happened to me? And I'd look at friends at school and think, why don't I look like they look? And so it's something that's actually very common in modelling and yet isn't understood. And I think that, when we talk about stigma, there's also layers of stigma, and they can be related to privilege as well. So many people may feel that because I am suitable for modelling in many ways, I have the kind of model dimensions. When clothes are made for catwalks, they're made for specific measurements, and I happen to have those. And then the rest, almost all of the fashion industry then builds from people that are shaped like me. But that doesn't in and of itself necessarily mean that your relationship with your body is easier. So the body dysmorphia was something that took a while to overcome. But then I think when I was really struggling with my mental health as I grew up, that was part of where the eating disorder came from, because I'd already had a background of self-loathing in terms of my appearance, and I already had a distorted view of myself that I still had to fight against. And then, I start picking up more symptoms, and soon enough it's a whole eating disorder.
Yeah, and it sounds like you've had quite a journey, and you're breaking the stigma as we're talking when people watch this. I love what you said in the sense of, and respect it, that people, you might look the part and you might look like the fashion, and people look on the screen, they wish they were you, when they see you in the clothes or walking the catwalk or wherever it might be. But a part of you wishes you looked somehow different, or the you that you see in front of you isn't a you that you necessarily liked for a long time. Am I understanding you right?
Yeah, definitely more so the latter one, that I had a very distorted view of my body. And that is something that I've really had to work on. The elements of that still remain. And it can be almost comical at times how extreme that can be. So for me, I can hardly notice when other people have put on weight or lost weight. Unless they tell me, I may not even pick up on it unless it's very dramatic. And yet the smallest change in my body, or me being a bit bloated after a big meal, that feels like I've put on weight, even though that's not reality. And that is what this way of thinking does to you. And then what compounds it is learning that there's a kind of control and a gamification, I describe it as, that can come from eating disorders. So there can be particularly a reason why these develop so young is because when you're a young person, the food you put into your mouth can often be one of the few things you are in control of. And so if you're not feeling in control in certain areas of your life, then that can naturally lead to a hyper focus on something you can control. And so for me, it was eating, but equally for other people, it can develop into OCD. It can develop into compulsive behaviors. It can develop with anger management issues. There's so many ways that people in struggling to cope can pick up unhealthy mechanisms. And that was the one for me. And it can be a strange thing to talk about within the context of modelling, because people may be kind of expect it to an extent, but they don't quite realise where it comes from. They maybe think, oh, the industry does this to them. And in my experience, actually, it's usually people coming into modelling with issues that are exacerbated in the pressure cooker of so much focus on your appearance. And you go to a casting and you're not picked, And sometimes in the casting, you've hardly even got to speak to the casting directors. So it's, of course you're going to go away and think it's just all to do with my appearance. It's nothing to do with they needed this many guys, or they needed a certain height or hair color or anything like that. It's, there must be something wrong with me. And so that can really make these issues worse.
That makes sense. And Bobby, what are some of the things that you've done to help cope with this? So we talked about the unhealthy coping skills to control the eating. How did you work through recovering this? I know you saw a therapist, but what were some of the things you did or they recommended?
Sure. So it's a long process, and for me, a lot of it was breaking down the causes. That so often we can get really focused on the behaviours, and I think a lot of the stigma can come from that misunderstanding. And I think there's parallels with addiction as well. Someone might naively think, when I was at my worst, why didn't you just eat more? Why didn't someone just pressure you into eating? Not knowing that actually I would have just found ways to offset that, or I might have not eaten anything the following day, so that I felt back in control and back in the safety of a behaviour that had become so much a part of my routine that it was a major part of my life. And I feel like it's kind of equal with addiction and what you'll deal with, that for those that don't understand different mental illnesses, it can seem like there are these easy answers. Well, just, let's just find a way to cut off their supply. And then you find yourself having conversations with people and saying, well, actually, there are some situations where someone is so far down their addiction that they need to be tapered off it, or they need other drugs in order to survive the adverse effects of coming off those habits. And, so that's where I think I've learned so much in terms of like managing my own mental health, but also universally, that we can't ignore what the causes were. And so a lot of it for me was finding a way to take more control of my life in healthier ways. So like getting my own flat, moving to a job that was causing me less stress, taking more control. Now obviously I'm self-employed with my work. And so these are all ways that I was able to put positive progress into my life so that there wasn't as much pressure on the unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Wow.
Because I truly believe you can't treat any kind of mental illness that involves these kind of habits or compulsive behaviours without putting healthy in its place.
Yeah, you said we can't treat it without putting health into us. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
So that's powerful because I really appreciate the message that you have to offer. And so you talked some about a few things just to back up for a second. You talked about how the one thing that you could control, or one of the things you could control, was eating, and how kids use that as, the one thing, either eating or compulsive behavior, to feel like they have some control to manage these challenging situations, and how you begin to free yourself through therapy and through other practices. And then fast forwarding a little bit, you have a mission, you have kind of a signature that you're releasing out for people to sign, or a form for people to sign to be a part of a petition, and you have your podcast. So let's start with the podcast. Tell us about your guest and what you do.
Sure. So we have a different guest every week. We had a bit of a hiatus to cover specifically COVID-19, and we're now back to normal episodes as our life kind of starts to get back to this new normal. And one of our most recent interviews was with Rachel Graham, co-founder of, almost called it Hope Springs, Healing Spring, co-founder of Healing Springs
You could call
Ranch.
it Hope Springs.
So similar name, I guess. And so she was on to talk about addiction, and that'll come out in a few weeks. And so, every episode we cover either a specific mental illness, or we cover a more general factor in mental health. And, I've learned a lot from it, and I really enjoy the conversations and learning from people's perspectives. We try and really bring in diversity into the show in every way we can. I certainly think a lot of the American listeners really appreciate the maybe learning that there's not just one British accent, and actually there's all sorts. And but I also think that's just so important in terms of understanding mental health, that it affects each of us differently. So whilst there is huge crossover, that doesn't mean there is a one solution for each condition or for mental health in general. Obviously, stigma is a big part of the solution I work on, but you know, there's so much to be learned, and so I've really enjoyed that process myself and going along the learning process with my listeners.
Yeah, we love Rachel here. I'm glad you had her on the show. She's got tons of energy, and she brings a great message.
Yeah, it's been a slightly interesting one to listen back to, of the like contrast as well of like approaches and accents, because she's just so fiery, and then I like respond to something she's saying and I sound monotone in comparison. But I love that, you know, I love just as many different perspectives as we can have, different experiences.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then you have this petition you're having people sign. Can you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So through the campaigning work I do and through the podcast, I saw time and time again how important understanding mental health is in terms of tackling stigma. And a lot of how I think people are being set up to fail when it comes to that understanding is lack of education. So from my own experience, for example, I went through my primary and secondary schooling with no idea really about mental health. It was something that wasn't even mentioned once. And yet something seemingly as taboo as sex education was a whole part of our curriculum. And we learnt about Shakespeare and plays like Romeo and Juliet, where the two main characters take their own life, and it's just like the end. And there's no conversation about what that means. Or you study something like Macbeth, and the guilt and the trauma of killing somebody really haunts Lady Macbeth, and yet it's just kind of a funny, dramatic thing that makes for interesting story. But you know, for a young person, being around that silence, it really sows a seed of stigma. That we basically learn, oh, we can talk about sex with our teacher, how weird is that? Or we can talk about physical health, we can talk about all these other areas, but we can't mention mental health. That's not allowed. And so people still grow up today, oftentimes struggling with mental illness like I did, and yet at the same time learning to demonize it, and that it's not something they can speak up about. And then no wonder, you know, often this festers and can get much worse, and then it's not until much later, maybe adulthood, that we get the help. And you know, the more I understood that, the more I confirmed the idea that this can't go on any longer. And so that's where the petition came out. So the petition is for mental health education to be in all schools in the UK. And so far, there's been a lot of success with it. So we're about to hit 200,000 signatures. We have got it being rolled out from September in England and Wales. So you know, 2 of the 4 countries in the UK. So, but that makes up the vast majority of schools already. And so now it's Scotland and Northern Ireland, in order to make sure every kid gets access to this education. And it's been an incredible process to see that change, to see governments slowly taking this more seriously. And I've been really proud to be a part of literally working line by line in the education of what should be included. And so it goes far beyond what we might think of as the kind of the basics or the essentials of like, here are some common symptoms, here are some common conditions, here's where you go to get help. And beyond that talks about what to me are vital life skills, like self-care, like understanding what is a healthy relationship, whether that's in a family, whether that's romantically as the kids grow older. And you know, such a broad perspective that I'm really proud of.
It's a great achievement. It's a lot of work into that. I'm sure it wasn't easy, but well worth it for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's definitely my proudest achievement so far, but yeah, still more to be done.
Probably the first of many, I'm sure. Yeah. So we're starting to come to a close on time. Is anything out there you would like to say, a message to a viewer who's maybe gone through something similar, whether it's older or younger, or they're going through depression or body dysmorphia? What would you like to share with them?
Sure. I think maybe being a podcaster, I have so many of these in my head. Like at the end of every episode, I say, "You are enough." And it's these phrases and these mantras that have been a big part of helping me through, and realizing that through the ups and downs of recovery, or just life, even if you've never been diagnosed with a mental illness, we've all got to understand that there should be less focus on the goal and more focus on the journey, and that actually it's false. It doesn't exist, this idea that I will get to a certain point in my life and then I will be happy, or then I will be right and acceptable to the world. Actually, we have to learn to have self-love through that journey and know that our worth is far beyond our achievements. So I guess that's a big message of mine. And then a kind of add-on message to that is that I'm really keen to normalise mental health as much as possible, and specifically mental illness, because so often it's still seen as something that's wrong with you, as in wrong with your character, wrong with your identity, whereas really it's just something you're going through and something that you can overcome. So it's an interesting line to take at times, where on one hand I'm really pro own your condition, own what you've been through, have the power to speak up and get help, but also it doesn't define you and it doesn't intrinsically affect your worth. And so, the longer I do this, the more that I have these conversations and meet such inspirational people who have had experience of mental illness, the more I come to the conclusion that actually mental illness is normal. It is a basic part of how we respond to trauma. In the same way, we have injuries physically that we heal from, and that's part of the process of survival. In the same way, we all go through things in life, and for some of us, they trigger symptoms of mental illness. For others, it triggers an entire mental illness, but that is us trying to cope. And we can trace that back to the fight or flight response. We can trace that to the coping mechanisms that I've described as a way that we are desperately trying to survive through trauma at times. And so actually, that's the normalization I want to do. Not we shouldn't be stigmatized, we should be fully accepted no matter what mental illness you go through. And specifically, that's why I was so keen to talk to you about this in general, but also about addiction and so much of the brilliant work you do, because that's one where there's still so much growth to do. There's still so much stigma specific to that mental illness. So many people still think it's a personal fault, or it's intrinsically linked to criminality, or that people have done something wrong in their life and the addiction is only a way to escape the wrong that they've done. All these, to me, crazy theories, and instead it's about people that are struggling and they need help because the coping mechanisms they've found are harming them. And so I'm so delighted there's people like you and Rachel and your whole organisation that are giving that help and understanding and love.
Yeah, hopefully we can do it together.
Yeah.
So, Bobby, where can people find you?
Sure. So the easiest thing would be if you search my name, Bobby Temps, it's Bobby with a Y, on Google or just your favourite podcast app, and you'll find my podcast or my campaign. Just because it's UK based doesn't mean that people around the world can't sign it. It all counts. So yeah, there's some places to find me.
So that was a powerful interview. Bobby really made it personal, and indeed deep for all of us, and his message that we're not alone and that mental health should be just as normal as physical health and treated that way. That we can look at our trauma, look at our experiences as the road back home, and through destigmatizing all these different challenges that we go through in our life, whether it be addiction or depression, can really allow us to heal. And I hope you check out his Twitter site. I hope you check out his webpage as well. We'll post all that for you because it's a great mission and one that can help all of us. And we'll see you next time.